Chapter 14. I woke up on a wide, low bed, nestled against the wall and covered with sheepskins. I was hot in the room, and the flickering light of the thick candle revealed a dirt floor, chalky white walls, and a thatched roof. A cross hung from the chimney-piece. A woman sat staring into the high flames of the fire. She was barefoot, in a tight skirt and coarse linen. Her jerkin of rabbit pelts with so many holes was unbuttoned to the waist. Noticing that I was awake, she approached and sat down on the bed, which groaned under her weight. She lifted my chin and looked attentively at me. Her eyes were watery blue. When she smiled, she did not cover her mouth with her hand, as was customary here. Instead, she displayed 2 rows of yellowish, uneven teeth. She spoke to me in a local dialect which I could not fully understand. She persisted in calling me her poor gypsy, her little Jewish foundling. At first, she would not believe that I was a mute. Occasionally, she looked inside my mouth, rapped at my throat, tried to startle me, but she soon stopped when I stayed silent. She fed me hot, thick borscht, and carefully inspected my frozen ears, hands, and feet. She told me her name was Laina. She felt safe and contented. I felt safe and contented with her. I liked her very much. In the daytime, Laina was out to work in domestic. Some of the richer peasants, especially those with sick wives or too many children. Often she took me along so I could have a decent meal, although it was said at the village that I could be delivered to the Germans. Laina replied to such remarks with a torrent of curses, shouting that all were equal before God, and that she was no Judas to sell her neighbor for silver coins. In the evenings, Laina used to receive guests in her hut. Men who must manage to get her out of the house came to her hut with bottles of vodka and baskets of food. The hut contained a single erroneous bed that could have easily accommodated 3 people. Between one edge of the bed and the wall there was a wide space where Laina had piled sacks, old rags, sheepskins, thus providing me with a place to sleep. I always went to sleep before the guest arrived. I was often awakened by their singing and their boisterous toast, but I pretended to be asleep. I did not wish to risk the beating Laina often half-heartedly said I deserved. With eyes nearly closed, I would watch what was happening in the room. The drinking bout would begin, at last, far into the night. Usually one man would stay after the others had left. He and Laina would sit down against the warm oven and drink from the same cup. When she would sway uncertainly and lean towards the man, he would place a huge blanket hand on her flabby thighs and slowly move it up her skirt. Laina at first seemed indifferent, then struggled a little. The man's other hand slid from beneath her neck, down inside her blouse, squeezing her breast so hard that she uttered a cry and panted hoarsely. At times the man kneeled on her floor and pushed his face aggressively into her groin, biting as though the skirt would while squeezing her buttocks with both his hands. Often he would strike her groin abruptly with the edge of his hand, and then she would bend over and moan. The candle was put out. They would undress in the dark, laughing and cursing, stumbling over the furniture and each other, impatiently shredding their clothing, overturned bottles that would roll across the room. When they tumbled into the bed, I feared it would collapse. While I thought of the rats who lived with us, Laina and her guests tossed about the bed, wheezing and fighting, calling on God and Satan, the man howling like a dog, the woman grunting like a pig. Often, in the middle of the night, in the midst of my dreams, I suddenly awoke to the floor between the bed and the wall. The bed quivered above me, shifted by the body struggling in convulsive fits. Finally, it began to move over the tilted floor towards the center of the room. Unable to crawl back into the bed, from which I fell, I had to crawl under it and push it back against the wall. Then I returned to my pallet. The dirt floor under the bed was cold and moist and covered with cat feces, the remains of birds that had been dragged in. As I crawled in the dark, I tore at thick cobwebs, and frightened spiders ran over my face and hair. Warm little bodies of mice fled in their holes, brushed against me as they passed. Touching this dark would, with my naked body, always fill me with revulsion and fear. I would crawl out from under the bed, wipe the cobwebs off my face, and wait shivering for the proper moment to push it back towards the wall. Gradually my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I looked on while the great sweating body of the man mounted a trembling woman. She embraced his fleshly buttocks with her legs, which resembled the wings of a bird crushed under a stone. The peasant groaned and sighed heavily, gathered up the woman's body under his head, raised himself, and with the back of his head struck her breast. They flapped loudly like a wet cloth being beaten against a rock. He swooped down on her, nailed her motionless to the bed. Labina, crying incoherently, struck his back with her hands. Sometimes the man lifted the woman, forced her to kneel on the bed, leaned over her elbows, and mounted her from the back, beating her rhythmically with his belly and thighs. I looked on with disappointment and disgust at the two intertwined, twitching human frames, so that what love was, savage as a bull, prodded with a spike, brutal, smelly, sweaty. This love was like a brawl in which man and woman wrestled, pleasure from each other, fighting, incapable of thought, half-stunned, wheezing, less than human. I recalled the moments I had passed with Uka, how differently I treated her. My touch was gentle, my hands, my mouth, my tongue, hovered cautiously over her skin, soft and delicate, like gossamer floating in the windless warm air. I continually sought out new sensitive places, unknown to her, bringing them to life with my touch, as rays of sunshine revive a butterfly chilled by the cold air of the autumn night. I remembered my elaborate efforts, and how they released within the girl's body some yearning and tremors that I otherwise would have been imprisoned there forever. I freed them, wanting her only to find pleasure in herself. The loves of Labina and her guests were soon over. They were like short spring thunder showers that wet the leaves and grass but never reached the roots. I remember how many games with Uka never really ceased but dimmed when Meeker and Quail intruded on our lives. They continued long into the night, like a peat fire whipped gently by the wind. Yet even this love was extinguished as fast as burning logs are smothered with a shepherd's horse blanket. As soon as I became temporarily incapable of playing with her, Uka forgot me. To the warmth of my body, the tender caress of my arms, the gentle touch of my fingers in my mouth, she preferred the stinky, hairy goat of his loathsome, deep penetration. Finally, the bed stopped quivering. The slackened carcass sprawled there like a slaughtered cattle, settled to sleep. Then I pushed the bed back to the wall, climbed over it, and lay down on the cold corner, pulling all the sheepskins over me. On rainy afternoons, Labina grew melancholic and talked about her husband, Laba, who was no longer alive. Many years ago, Labina had been a boastful girl, whom the richest peasants wooed. But against reasoned advice, she fell in love and married Laba, the poorest farmhand in the village, known only as the handsome one. Laba indeed was handsome, tall and popular, nimble as a top. His hair shone in the sun, his eyes were bluer than the fair sky, and his complexion was as smooth as a child's. When he looked at a woman, her blood ran fire, and lustful thoughts raced through her head. Laba knew that he was good-looking, and he aroused admiration and lust in women. He liked to parade about the woods and bathe in the pond naked. He would glance into the bushes and know that he was being watched by the young virgins and married women. But he was the poorest farmhand in the village. He was hired by the rich peasants, and had endured many humiliations. These men knew that Laba was desired by their wives and daughters, and they would humble him for it. They also bothered Labina, knowing that her penniless husband depended on them, and could only look on helplessly. One summer day, Laba did not return home after the field. He did not return the next day or the next day. He vanished like a stone dropping to the bottom of a lake. It was as though he was drowned or sucked in by the swamp, or some jealous suitor had knifed him and buried him at night in the forest. Life went on without Laba. Only the saying, handsome as Laba, survived in the village. A lonely year without Laba passed. People forgot him, and only Labina believed that he was still alive and would return. One summer day, when the villagers rested on the short shadows of the trees, a cart pulled by a fat horse emerged from the forest. In the cart lay a large chest covered by a cloth, and next to it walked handsome Laba in a beautiful leather jacket, slung hasher fashion over his shoulders, and trousers of the finest cloth, and tall shining boots. The children ran among the huts, carried the news, and men and women swarmed towards the road. Laba greeted them all with a nonchalant wave, while wiping the sweat off his brow and prodding the horses. Labina was already waiting at the doorway. He kissed his wife, unloaded the enormous chest, and entered the hut. The neighbors gathered in front, admiring the horse and cart. After waiting impatiently for Laba and Labina to reappear, the villagers began to jest. He had rushed to her like a buck to a goat, they said. Cold water should be poured over them. Suddenly the doors of the hut opened, and a crowd gasped with astonishment. On the threshold stood handsome Laba in a suit of unimaginable splendor. He wore a striped silk shirt with a stark white collar around his tanned neck and garish tie. His soft flannel suit begged to be touched. A satin handkerchief stuck out of his breast pocket like a flower. To this was added a pair of black lacquered boots, and as a crowning glory a gold watch hanging from his breast pocket. The peasants gasped in awe. Nothing like this had happened in the history of the village. Usually the inhabitants wore homespun jackets, trousers sewed together from 2 lengths of cloth, and boots of rough tanned leather nailed to a thick wooden sole. Laba extracted them from his chest. Innumerable colorful jackets of unusual cut, trousers, skirts, patent leather shoes, shining with such luster that they could serve as mirrors, and handkerchiefs, ties, socks, and underclothes. Handsome Laba became the supreme object of local interest. Unusual stories went out about him. Various surmises were made about the origin of all these priceless objects. Labina was showered with questions she could not answer, for Laba only gave vague replies, contributing even more to the growth of the legend. During church services, no one looked at the priest or the altar. They all watched the right-hand corner of the nave, where handsome Laba sat stiffly with his wife, in his black satin suit and flowered shirt. On his wrist he wore a glittering watch, at which he would glance ostentatiously. The priest's vestments, once in very acumen of ordainess, now seemed dull as a wintry sky. The people sitting near Laba delighted in the unusual fragrances that wafted from him. Labina confided that they derived from a number of little bottles and jars.